I love that ability they have to stay steady, but still, kind of be big teddy bears, right? Like all of them have a nougaty center, and it's delightful. and so I have learned. I would say this is the type that I had to grow into an appreciation for, and now that I'm there, I just adore them. I just adore them, and I love that pragmatic philosopher side.
Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So we are rolling along in our series, going through all 16 of the Myers-Briggs personality types, talking about how each type can show themselves love. And this week we're talking about ISTJs.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to unpack how an ISTJ can best showcase themselves love. But stay tuned, because if you're not an ISTJ, first of all, you're going to learn a ton about ISTJs on this show. But you'll also, at the end of the show, we're going to talk about a principle we took from ISTJ self-love that the rest of us, the other 15 personality types, can learn from and apply to our lives as well. So we're going to, even if you're not ISTJ, you're going to learn a lot about this type this week, but we're also going to give you something to take away from your own life as well.
Right. Because every personality type, when they have figured out how to properly show and receive love, show themselves love and receive love from themselves, there's like a transcendent sort of attitude they take, right? There's a transcendent experience, and there is something that each of the personality types model for the rest of us.
Yeah.
That we can sort of ascend to, right? Like something that we can try to manifest ourselves by observing them. And ISTJs are no different.
Yeah. And I have so my parents just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary recently.
Right.
At the time of this recording. And we were at their event, and my aunt and uncle were there. My uncle, who's in his 70s, is ISTJ preferences. And so I got to spend a lot of concentrated time around him recently. And in the last few years, he moved into Pennsylvania, where we live here in our state. So I've been around him a lot more than my whole life, because he used to live in New York away from us as a kid. So I've gotten to know him a little bit better later in his life. And it's interesting to see a real world example of an ISTJ in my life who has gone through all the experiences, all the learning, his entire career. He's in his retirement age now. And it's interesting to see the wisdom he brings to the table. I want to reference some of that a little bit later in this show. And then many of our clients now, I think in the early days of Personality Hacker, we're weird, come and do personality weird stuff with us two ENPs. But over time, I think people warm up to it. And I think we've seen a lot more clients come into our world for coaching, for some of our high level programs. We just had an ISTJ go through one of our deep dive personal growth programs. So ISTJs are top of my mind right now. And I think there's a lot to this type. And I think a lot of people misunderstand ISTJs. As common as they might seem, I think that they have some unique challenges in finding an expression of self-love. So that's what we want to talk about.
Yeah, especially in the contemporary world where everything is moving so quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a couple premises I want to...
Let's do it.
Tracks I want to lay down. So almost beats I want to hit that we have talked about in every previous episode of this series.
That makes an ISTJ feel very comfortable that we're going to keep a consistency. My guess would be. Let me know in the comments, ISTJ listening, if that makes you feel good.
They're like, this is the only one I've ever listened to, so I don't care about the other ones. But it makes you feel good, so your little inner ISTJ.
I have a little inner ISTJ, yes.
That's right. So I'm going to actually speak to your inner ISTJ and hit all the beats. The first one is one of the premises we're coming at in this series is that we're actually always showing ourselves love, or we're at least attempting to. We love ourselves. We can't stop it. It's just a compulsion, right? It's like it's pre-wired inside of ourselves. And that's a good thing, because that's a huge part of why we survive, is because we are very interested and invested in our own in our own survival, and for putting ourselves in situations that nourish us. And so love is nourishing. And so we're always trying to send ourselves love. The challenge is that we have a bunch of obstructions to receiving it.
Yeah.
And so loving ourselves is a matter of not showing more love. Usually it's a matter of removing all of the obstructions to receiving that love. And that means we need to be setting proper expectations for ourselves.
Yeah.
If we set too high of expectations for ourselves, we become demoralized because we can't achieve them. But if we set too low of expectations for ourselves, we don't feel like we're respecting, showing ourselves the respect and the faith in ourselves that, that we can hit those high metrics or, hit those high expectations.
Yeah.
So a lot of removing obstructions to feeling that love is to set calibrated expectations for ourselves. And our best fit type helps us to determine what are appropriate expectations. So we have certain cognitive functions or mental wiring, or we're pre-wired to focus on certain things and to be naturally talented in some areas and less talented in other areas. And so we're using type as a model for setting those expectations because how we're pre-wired can tell us, well, what are areas that we're already going to do pretty well in?
Yeah.
What are areas that we're already talented in? And then can we amp those up with higher levels of skill? And then what are areas that we're not as talented in? What are areas that we're sort of pre-wired to not be looking at? And so can we set more calibrated, more reasonable expectations in those areas?
Yeah. And one way to look at this is if you're in a relationship with another person, I mean, that's the framework that's really easy to understand. You might love that person without condition. In fact, you should love that person. If love has conditions, it's not really love. Mm-hmm. You're setting to a partner. Let's say you're in a romantic partnership or a parent-child relationship or a friendship. Sending love to somebody, if it's conditional, well, that means I'm only going to love you if, and then fill in the blank. And in the same way, we would look at ourselves in that relationship. If you have conditions for loving yourself, that would be as absurd as having a condition on a partner to show them love. Like if you do X, then I'll show you love. Now, the thing is though, we can look at relationships like it still is an expectation in a relationship that you're going to meet certain markers to maintain the relationship itself. So the channel of love can be sent, right? And this is why relationships break apart is the discord that enters into the connection between two people. It may not be the love that is not freely given. It's the relationship breakdown, right? So a healthy relationship has proper expectations. Like I expect things of you, Antonia. We're in a relationship together. I have expectations of you. It's okay to have those expectations. Now, to condition my love that I send you based on those expectations, that's not true love.
Right. I think the way that we've said it in previous episodes is that love isn't earned.
Yeah.
But a good relationship is.
Yes.
Right. And that includes with ourselves. So we can't earn love from ourselves. We can't set conditions on whether or not we're going to show and receive love from ourselves. But we can earn a good relationship with ourselves.
Yeah.
And we earn that by setting appropriate and proper expectations and meeting them, right? And not putting too much or too little on ourselves.
And yet people do this all the time, right? They say, I will love myself when, and there's some marker, usually external marker, that they have to meet in order to accept the love that they want to send to themselves, which is really weird. But we all do it. It's not just ISTJs or any particular type. Everybody does this depending on your station of life and all that. So you mentioned we're going to work through what's called the cognitive functions of personality for ISTJs. So ISTJ, that's just the starting point. That gives you what's called dichotomies. That gives you a basic understanding of your personality type, like you're an introvert, sensing preferences, but that's almost like a decoder ring for what's called cognitive functions. Technically, we use a metaphor to understand these. So I'm going to go through this oversimplified, a quick cursory check-in, just so you can follow along. If you want to go deeper, I recommend in our ISTJ Owner's Manual, which is a program that we offer on our website, personalityhacker.com. It has a portion of that Owner's Manual that's called the CAR model. And the CAR model is a great framework to understand the wiring of your mind as an ISTJ. It basically lays out the cognition of how you're learning information or perceiving your world and how you're making judgments or deciding what you're going to do with that information, how you're going to act upon the information you bring in. And we just like this CAR model. Imagine your mind is a 4-passenger vehicle and you have a driver driving the vehicle of your life. You have a co-pilot in the front seat next to the driver. In the back seat are some kids, like a family would be driving in a car. You have a 10-year-old sitting right behind the co-pilot, and then behind the driver sits a 3-year-old. And these are, again, representative of the mental processes for an ISTJ. So for an ISTJ, the driver process is a mental cognitive function that we've nicknamed memory. Doesn't mean you have a good memory, although you can have a good memory as an ISTJ, but it means that you're tapped into what has come before. What are the memories, both societal or writ large memories and both personal memories, that have shaped who you are, who the people are around you, and society at large? Like, what has happened over a long timeline and what changes have been happening that have led us here? It's very focused on this. It understands these things. It understands things like It technically called introverted sensing is the technical name of this function for an ISTJ. It understands things like precedent, replication, keeping consistency, like my desire to keep these podcasts consistent in this series. It's a very introverted sensing or memory style focus. Templates, making sure we have consistency and continuity over time.
Yeah, like standards.
Yes, standards, all these kinds of things. But it also can be personal memories, personal stories of how I got to be who I am in this moment of life. So this is what drives an ISTJ. This is the driver mental process for an ISTJ. It's a perceiving process, it's a learning information process. At the co-pilot level for an ISTJ is a mental process. It's a decision-making function. It's technically called extroverted thinking. We've nicknamed it effectiveness. It's all about getting results. What does A plus B plus C equal? And I'm looking for what it equals, the result in life. I want to output. It's good at resource management, understanding numbers and metrics. It can track things and put things on a timeline and get projects done, good for project management. It makes sense to think and construct things in the outer world and produce, like actually get results. Not just theoretical, but real world tangible results.
Right. And tapped into progress, making progress on a timeline.
Amelioration, progress, all these kinds of things. Again, I'm overgeneralizing these. The entire owner's manual for ISTJs goes way deeper into this, right? There's a whole thing with it. I'm just going so you can follow along this conversation. So those two functions for an ISTJ, the driver, co-pilot, that is your strength for an ISTJ. But sitting behind, there's some challenging news. You have a 10-year-old sitting behind the co-pilot. We've nicknamed this authenticity, this process. Its technical name is introverted feeling. It's all about your core motivations, what drives you, the inner feelings that you carry. It also can be tuned into things like expression and art and who you are as a person, your individuality and how it's expressed. That's what the 10-year-old of authenticity would be focused on for an ISTJ. And the 3-year-old for an ISTJ, the nickname is exploration. Technical name is extroverted intuition. This is imagination in the outer world. So it's imagination in real time and pattern recognition and intuition in real time, taking things that are maybe seemingly disconnected or unconnected and connecting them and see what's made from the new combination. And for an ISTJ, this is about a 3-year-old's sophistication. When I say sophistication, I don't mean capacity or ability. That can be trained over time. When I say sophistication, I mean the certainty of this part of yourself. So you have about a 3-year-old certainty in this area of your life. In the 10-year-old spot, you have about a 10-year-old certainty. And so as we talk about the expectations for each of these places in your car model as an ISTJ, when we talk about the certainty in those two functions in the backseat of your car, you're going to have some uncertainty on how they show up for you. You might have spent a life having to focus on one of those areas, maybe for career reasons or family reasons or just circumstance. But you're always going to feel uncertain there. And so as we look at showing yourself love as an ISTJ, that's going to influence your relationship with yourself and the expectations that you have on yourself. And if you have too high of expectations there, that can be a challenge. If you have too low of expectations for your driver and co-pilot, that can also be a challenge.
Right, exactly. That certainty is important because if we have high expectations in an area in which we are always deeply uncertain, we never know if we're hitting the mark.
Yeah.
And the intuitive function for an ISTJ, it's not just imagination. One of the things that comes up here with extroverted intuition or exploration is also an ability to sell an idea, or the ability to persuade, the ability to think outside the box and to have creative problem solving, the ability to ask what if questions that lead to brainstorming, new innovations. And this is an important part of an ISTJ, but it's always uncertain in the sense that if a person is more tapped into the certainty of precedents and the certainty of standards, then are we just going to introduce a disruptive technology or a disruptive schedule or any sort of disruption? Because that intuitive part, that extroverted intuition or exploration, is a highly disruptive function. And that's part of what it does, right?
If it ain't broken, don't fix it.
Right,
kind of thinking, right? Why would I disrupt something that's working and has consistency to it?
Exactly.
It has to make sense.
Right. So you might, as somebody with ISTJ preferences, you might think all sorts of creative thoughts, but should I implement it?
Yeah.
What should I do with it? So as we go through each of these 4 functions, I want to lay the tracks, or we want to lay the tracks of what expectation should one have for themselves in these functions, and how do we make sure that proper expectations open up that conduit to experiencing love from the self. Remove those obstructions.
Yeah, we're just going to talk about this, again, broad brush here on this conversation about self-love. If you want to know more, I do recommend getting the ISTJ Owner's Manual. It goes way deeper into that car model. It shows you all sorts of things like loops and grips, which are ways that your brain hijacks you and prevents you from getting the results you want in life. It's a whole thing, right, that you go down the rabbit hole of. We're just talking about self-love on this, and so we're going to approach it from that level. But
That's
there's
right. It's a whole thing.
There's a ton more to unpack.
It's a whole thing. That's right.
So let's jump into it. Let's talk about that driver.
All right. So what kind of expectations should an ISTJ have for their introverted sensing or memory function? And I'm glad that you mentioned that it's not about having a good memory.
Yeah.
Introverted sensing or the memory function it's about processing experiences that somebody has had. Now, it doesn't have to be you, right? You can process an experience another person had and still take the learning from it. So that allows this function a little bit of a get out of jail free card sometimes, right? Like it's like, oh, I don't have to have personally experienced it. I can borrow experiences from others. So what kind of expectations should an ISTJ have for this function if it doesn't have to be my personal direct experience? Well, the first thing is to ensure one is doing proper reflection time. And it does need to be primarily one's own experiences. So I started to see the introverted functions, all 4 of the introverted functions as effectively like their job is to process. Like with introverted feelings, key job is to process emotions, right? Process feelings, understand what it means to the person. Introverted thinking is to process information, data, and opinions, basically.
By the way, side note, introverted thinking and also introverted intuition, you don't have as an ISTJ. We're adding some extra content in here.
Yeah, exactly. So
I didn't want to confuse anyone.
If you are new to this, there's 4 other functions that people use. And 2 of them are introverted functions that you don't use. But to people who are a little bit more versed in this, I've started to see the introverted functions as their primary job is to process, right? And as mentioned, introverted feeling is to process emotions and process identity. Introverted thinking is to process opinion and things that are logically consistent, process our paradigms, basically our beliefs, the things that we think. Introverted intuition or perspectives is to, by the way, introverted thinking's nickname is accuracy. Introverted intuition or perspectives is to process our imaginings, right? Like the things that strike us, our intuitions that hit us, the things that we're foreseeing into the future, symbols and energies and archetypes. What does this mean for me? So the introverted, like the fact that these functions are introverted means that our job is to process them, is to really allow them to have a complete cycle. With introverted feeling, do a complete emotional processing so that on the other side, you feel a relief from that emotion. For introverted thinking, it's to do the sufficient thought labor, like quote unquote, bring out the receipts to have a complete truth, right? Not just something that's sort of sounds like it might be true, but to do the real work of taking all the information into consideration, including all the inconvenient information. And for introverted sensing, it's
memory.
For
which
memory,
you use as a driver as an ISTJ. So we're tuning back into your type. We're not talking about other types now. We're talking back about ISTJs specifically.
That's right. It's to process experiences, right? It's to process what you have experienced. And when you're doing that for yourself, I mean, there's no end to the reasons why people avoid memories from the past.
Yeah.
Right. They can be painful. They can be humiliating. They can be things that are so precious that you don't want to fully process them because you don't want to let go of them, right? It can be nostalgia. It can be maybe even idealizing. So there's lots of reasons why people avoid sufficient processing of their experiences from the past. But if you have high expectations for yourself as somebody who leads with this function, who has it as a driver, then no stone will go unturned, right? You're processing all of it. So if you have had failures, if you've had pain, if you've had trauma, if you've had abuse, if you have done something terrible to somebody else, right? Like you're the person that was that was the abuser in a moment, right? Not saying that you're an abusive person necessarily, but maybe you were the person who ended up being, the jerk in that moment. All of these things need to be completely processed. That means that the learning, the whole experience really needs to be seen and owned, right?
Accepted,
exactly. And so acceptance becomes this beautiful gift of the function, right? Whether you were on the receiving end of something not great or you were the perpetrator, whether or not you had this beautiful success or whether or not you had a humiliating failure. All of these things need to be processed. And so when you get to the other side of that, the gift is wisdom, right? Because wisdom is it's not just knowledge, it's not just information, it's applied knowledge and it's a lived experience. And it's on the other side realizing, well, where do I need to hold on to things like standards and precedent and consistency? And where's a moment when I really didn't need to? It didn't actually serve me in that moment. So there's an openness that ends up on the other side as well, because it's not just reframing things, or not reframing, but picking and choosing the moments that you'll reevaluate or review. It's not just highlighting the moments that were good for you or validated that you were right the whole time. It's really, truly learning from one's mistakes and not repeating them in the future. So high expectations for this functions means that you've got to do sufficient rumination.
Yeah. Well, and I think the way that an ISTJ might stretch this, because what we're talking about is expectations, and the capacity here is probably even more than you're tapping into as an ISTJ. So you have the ability to expand your capacity. And I think most ISTJs are fairly tuned in if they're relatively healthy and they relatively have a good experience of life. I think they do have a pretty good sense of like, okay, I accept that happened to me. Okay, that happened. I think where it starts to break down is when it's other people, maybe other people's past memories or other people's experiences. Sometimes it can be a resistance, like, I just can't accept that. Like, it wasn't personal enough to you, and it's hard to see it and accept that that is just what happened. There might be some resistance there. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the ways that there's some expanded capacity. Let's talk about what are the other ways that we could expand capacity. If you're an ISTJ listening right now, how can you ask yourself in a real tangible way for more from this part of yourself?
Yeah. So this function is also very connected to homeostasis.
Yeah.
Like, it knows that things are okay when it's experiencing a sense of comfort, right? Yeah. Because a big piece of this function is to keep us safe, honestly. This is a function that's very tuned into safety and making sure everybody's all right. And so comfort communicates a sense of safety, but comfort can be gamed, right? It can be manipulated. Meaning that you might be, 10 days from getting kicked out of a person, not the ISTJ, but a person could be 10 days from getting kicked out of their house, but they're anesthetizing themselves by watching TV and, like eating garbage, right? Eating bad for them foods and for their bodies, eating foods that are bad for them. And so that's a moment when you can be creating synthetic comfort, but is that comfort an actual sign that everything is okay?
Yeah.
And so having high expectations for introverted sensing means not gaming comfort. It means taking true comfort from establishing security. So part of that is how you treat your body. If you are gaming comfort by eating indulgently or not getting good exercise or not establishing a good routine of self-care, well, then, it feels comfortable to eat all the wrong foods, but that's not establishing sustainable comfort. Sustainable comfort comes from taking care of ourselves. It comes from being responsible and stepping up, from truly creating a situation of stability. That's where true, like sustainable comfort comes from. So having a high expectation in this function means creating sustainable comfort through taking care of yourself, taking care of your responsibilities, setting a good precedent for yourself and other people in your world, and creating a beautiful environment, an environment that feels good to you, feels good to your body, feels good to your emotions, feels good to your mind, right? Like truly, and a lot of work goes into that, by the way. You don't just do that by not doing things, right? You don't earn that. You don't earn comfort by not taking care of your responsibilities. You earn it by stabilizing. And then you have comfort on the other side that truly is an indicator, right? Like an instrument needle that indicates that everything's okay. So that's a big piece of high expectations. It's not gaming it. It's not creating synthetic comfort. It's creating true sustainable comfort.
Yeah.
Another thing that an ISTJ can tap into having high expectations is that introverted sensing or memory, it offers to people who have it as a strength the ability to get into routine and do things over and over and over again, and really get into the details of things. And so anything that is an area of interest for somebody with these preferences, high expectations doesn't just mean interest, it means mastery. It means doing things enough and often enough so that you become not a person who's just on the receiving end of other people's experiences and so receiving wisdom, but you're now the person lending wisdom.
A specialist.
Exactly.
You become specialized in this.
That's right. Exactly. And so having high expectations means expecting yourself to be a specialist, having high mastery in something. Now, it doesn't have to be your vocation. It doesn't have to be your profession. It could be an interest on the side, or it could be your profession. But it's not letting yourself just, clock out at the end of the day, go home and, watch TV and then fall asleep and then get up and do it the next day. It means really pursuing the things that are deeply interesting and fascinating to you.
I want to just make a comment that that's a valid life. To go to work and do your thing and just go home and watch TV. We're talking about this in the frame of showing yourself love. And our theory or our perspective is, our experience working with coaching clients as well, is that when you don't expect much of parts of you that could be expected to perform well, you diminish the ability to receive love from yourself. So the reason you're saying that is not that that's a better life than somebody that chooses what you're talking about. It's that we're talking about it through, we would think it is, but we're really specifically talking about in a framework of showing yourself love.
Well, it's a valid life in the sense that you get to choose it.
Yeah.
Like everybody gets to decide how they're going to live, right? And they get we have one life and we get to decide how we're going to live it. And honestly, even if we choose to end it, nobody can take that from us, right? Like we just get to choose however we want to live. So it's valid in that sense. But it's not a life that will lead to motivation and direction.
That's right.
And part of experiencing love, like receiving love from ourselves, is that our inner wisdom, the part that's trying to send love to us, it wants purpose. It wants direction. It wants motivation. It wants all the things that make people feel fulfilled, right? Nourished. And a big part of that is mastery for somebody with ISTJ preferences, is the excitement to continue curiosity, the excitement to learn more and more and more and expand one's sort of storehouse of information or capacity. So I think mastery is something that is something well within an ISTJ's frame. And so having that high expectation removes that obstruction of lethargy, of not really knowing why you're doing what you're doing, kind of like giving up on the things that are fascinating to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for letting me make that caveat, because I just want to make sure people understand this is about showing yourself love.
Right. And then finally, I would say that a high expectation is, as mentioned before, it's about processing the experiences you've had in the past. And a complete cycle of processing usually means letting things go. Mm-hmm. And so idealizing the past would also be, it would not be high expectations. It's processing the past and understanding that the past is complete, accepting the now, and recognizing that that there are always opportunities coming. Right? Mm. It's a sense of openness, and so idealizing the past is also something that would be a more sort of letting your introverted sensing off the hook or your memory off the hook. It's not doing complete cycles of processing.
I asked my uncle. This is just like a week ago, ISTJ preferences. I said, how do you think about the future? And he said, the future represents loss. He's like, all it means is things that I once had are going to be lost. That's all it represents to me. The past is where all the richness is. That's where all the things that have happened that were wonderful in my life. The future just represents less of that. And so I don't really like the future very much, because it just means the things that I have now are going to go away over time.
Yeah.
And I think that is, I would say that you're, as an ISTJ, probably resonate a lot with that.
Yeah. And that's an understandable perspective. And also, the future does have opportunities. And so,
all that past from my uncle was the future at one point.
That's right.
That's the thing. I was, when he said that, that's what I was reflecting. I was like, well, all of that was in his future a long time ago.
Yeah.
So he's seeing it from the perspective of right now, looking back, but all the things that will be coming in the next year or two will very quickly become his past to look back on.
That's right.
And so I think that faith, there's a faith in the introverted sensing or memory for an ISTJ to say, yeah, it may be a little bit uncertain what's coming, but I do know that once it's in my past, I can reflect on it and get the learning. And I know that that's what shapes me to who I am today.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And to be fair, he's in his 70s.
Yeah.
So when you're in elderhood, that's part of elderhood, is sort of contending with that the majority of your life is behind you.
Yeah.
And so that's probably also, that's not just ISTJ preferences, that's also probably his phase of life as well.
I would agree.
And at the same time, I would still say that he's a pretty balanced ISTJ.
Oh yeah.
And so I can appreciate him sharing that with us, even though I think even he recognizes that there's always, like you said, the past is it was the future at one time.
And he also lost 2 of his sons
Mm-hmm.
out of his 3 children. And so I also would interpret this very nuanced to say that part of the grief of the past is the lost future.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what he lost was the future potentiality. So the future represents loss in that, like, there's all this potential now, and every time something, quote unquote, dies, literally or figuratively, that means the future of that thing is also gone.
Mm.
And so in a way, I do think he's grieving the future, not
Yeah.
just the past.
Yeah.
In some ways. So I think there's some nuance in that for an ISTJ.
For sure. Okay. So let's not just make it about
So,
your uncle.
No, I understand
Yeah.
that. I just, sorry, I don't mean
Yeah.
to take us down that rabbit hole. I just think that's a very pinpoint on this memory function. So let's talk about that co-pilot though.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to just wallow in, oh no, the past is slipping. Because I think that I might bring ISTJs down. They're like, oh no, Joel, bring me down. But I do want to say there's a lot more here that we can talk about. So let's go to that co-pilot of extroverted thinking or effectiveness. So this is the part of you as an ISTJ that gets the job done,
Mm-hmm.
gets into action, outputs, manages resource, understands how to accomplish in the real world in a real way with tangible results.
Yeah.
So what's the proper expectation? I mean, it's going to be high, but what can we qualitatively say is the expectation for self-love here for an ISTJ?
So there's a model that I want to pull on and not go deep down in the rabbit's hole of it, but just reference it because we've done it in all the previous episodes as well. The driver function, the one that we just talked about, introverted sensing or memory, that's part of what Dr. John Beebe, who is a Jungian analyst, calls one half of the axis of relating to self, meaning that your driver function of introverted sensing or memory is a big part of how you see yourself. Like that's you. That's
self-perception.
That's your self-perception. That's right. That's what you bring to the world. When you get to the auxiliary function or what we're calling the co-pilot function, this is part of what he calls the axis of relating to others, meaning that this is part of your relationship to other people. So your driver and your co-pilot in the car model, they're both areas of certainty. One is about my certainty in me, right? And how I feel and who I am and bringing my certainty to the world. And the other one is my certainty when I'm relating to other people. And he calls this function a parent function, or at least he says it has the energy or the archetypal energy of a parent, meaning that this is the part of us that we show up and give to other people. So the reason why that's relevant is when we're setting our expectations for ourselves in this function, a part of that expectation is recognizing that you're going to show up with a parental energy. What do parents accept? Or what do they expect? Parents expect to give thanklessly, to give without return,
Yeah.
to pour into and invest in others, their children, primarily, without even so much as a thank you usually.
Well, it'd be nice to get a thank you, but
Right.
It's very rare sometimes until they're in their 40s, I guess.
Right, exactly. Until they have their own kids, they're like, oh, this is hard, right?
Thanks, Mom and Dad.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry I was such a weirdo back there.
Yeah, sorry I was a terrible teenager now that I'm dealing with my own terrible teenagers. So that's part of the expectation. And there's sometimes a shrinking back or a throttling of this function because it's exhausting giving and giving and giving. So the expectation for this function, just naturally, we're pre-wired to expect to give without return in this energy. So part of setting reasonable expectations is that that's not your job, is to endlessly give without return. All right. You can also self-parent with this function, meaning that you can turn the energy on yourself and give to yourself, right? And you can parent yourself with this. So what does that look like? What does it look like to parent other people and parent yourself with extroverted thinking or effectiveness? Well, there's a couple different things. The first one is to have an organized and structured environment, right? And bring that to both your occupation and to your family. Most people, and particularly children, thrive in structure. And so setting up systems that are streamlined, setting up systems that are organized, creating structured households even if you don't have actual children of your own, even if it's just you or if it's you and a partner, that's okay. People rest into this. And so being somebody who takes care of these things, handles details, handles getting things done, handles, sort of the planning of the family. These are gifts that you give to other people, whether or not they, recognize and are grateful for it. This is part of how you show up, and to have high expectations for yourself, to expect yourself to be good at figuring out streamlining opportunities and structuring things and setting up systems that make it so that everything runs smoothly. That's a reasonable expectation. Another reasonable expectation is to provide clear communication to others, and particularly constructive feedback. So providing clear constructive feedback to other people, this is hard to do, by the way. And that's one of the ways where we say that we recognize that these are high expectations. Sometimes ISTJs say that they struggle with communication. They don't know how to say things. They don't know how to communicate to other people, particularly on the fly. But extroverted thinking or effectiveness comes through for them if they build the skill, if they create articulation by not being verbose necessarily, but being direct, saying what needs to be said, providing feedback, and not with harshness, not with criticism, but just with setting expectations for other people and helping them understand how they can make progress in their own lives. Remember, this is a function that's tied into progress. And so helping other people understand how they can make progress in their own lives, set up their own structures, modeling what it means to be a responsible person and to take responsibility for your life, showing what it looks like to set goals and to work towards getting those goals done and to take responsibility for your impact and your outcomes, right? I think ISTJs do this beautifully, communicate both through modeling and through actual communication, through articulation, what it means to be a responsible human being, right? And to own your outcomes.
Yeah. I would think also a stretch of capacity here is in, we could use the word leadership. I would actually use the phrase selective dominance. Because sometimes, and this is what effectiveness knows, sometimes you got to pull rank to get the job done. Sometimes you just have to let people have their opinion of you, take the hits, and take selective dominance in the situation to execute. You have to get it done. And sometimes people aren't happy about that.
Yeah.
Pull rank, you're going to get a lot of flack. And I think some ISTJs might shrink back from that, feeling, ooh, do I have because that driver process, is this precedent? Am I allowed? Do I have permission? Is this the standard or procedure here? And sometimes you have to ignore that part of you and just pull rank anyway from this part of you. Step into the leadership role or the management role you need to do, to get it done. Go ahead and, command the troops, if you will. Get the project done, get the output you need. It might be for safety, it might be for resource, it might be just something needs to get done, kind of like a parent would. And then you can step back again into more of your responsive space. But this takes proactivity and the willingness to pull rank. And I think that's a little bit of a challenge, but that's a capacity stretch, I think, for extroverted thinking.
Yeah, well, we've moved into a time period that's very intuitive feeler, I would say. We're moving in a very NF time period and NT. And intuitives don't like that. Right.
Of course not.
And so the contemporary sentiment is this idea that dominance is always evil and wrong, and pulling rank is always the wrong thing to do. And yet you can see what happens when we're unwilling to pull rank, when we're unwilling to do what needs to be done. Right. We're unwilling to be, like you said, selectively dominant, not commandants, right? Not people who just come through and
not domineering.
That's right.
That's not your state of life, but you have to step into this at some times. You just have to.
Yeah.
It's needed and required of you as an ISTJ.
Absolutely. Well, and when we don't have that energy in the world, bridges start falling apart, right? And we have really terrible policy, and nobody's willing to do what needs to be done, and everything is, compassionate to the point of self-destruction. So I think that's actually a really good point. But it also can be done with compassion, right? It can be done in the best interest of everybody, right? In the best interest of people, we have to get things done.
And you might have to do it for yourself.
Right.
That's the key. Like you talked about this parent energy that goes out to others. Well, what about selective dominance in your own life? No, I'm pulling rank on my own other parts of myself. This needs to happen. I need to get this done. I have to step up for myself to have a good relationship with myself, which again opens up the channel of self-love, which is the whole point of what we're talking about.
That's right. And by doing that, I think people with ISTJ preferences, they end up leading by example in ethical conduct.
Yeah.
Right. They're models of consistency. they're not going to be hypocrites, right?
Yeah.
If they're going to do this, if they need something done and people need to get in line to do it, they're not going to be hypocritical and, let themselves off the hook. And that's a part of what they can show up and model when they have high expectations for themselves. So I think that's a great point. And pulling rank on the self, getting the self to do things that you don't particularly want to.
Yeah.
I think that's a fabulous one. And doing so because you know that you're trying to, once again, create sustainable, quote unquote, sustainable comfort, meaning that we can't always be comfortable, but safety and security, we know we're safe and secure when we feel a sense of comfort. And so having to do hard things, right? Comfort does not come from a lack of action. Comfort doesn't come from taking it easy. Comfort comes from doing hard work and working now so that one can relax and rest later.
Any other keynotes on this co-pilot before we move on?
I think there was one more note that I had made was facilitating decision making.
Yeah.
Helping other people and oneself make good decisions by gathering information, weighing pros and cons, considering the impact that these decisions will have. Self-parenting, showing love through high expectations of this function through self-parenting means making good decisions, being somebody who isn't waffling a lot, right? Yeah. Or isn't, quote unquote, waffling, isn't an analysis paralysis, but is in rumination to ensure that a good decision is made at the end of it. So taking one's time and being patient.
Well, and how do you do that? You have good heuristics. Mm-hmm. You've got good frameworks like this. I would use like a business example, a SWOT analysis, right? Strength, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. That's a framework that extroverted thinking or effectiveness would use to go, okay, what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, opportunities, threats? And you run through that heuristic or diagnostic to know, oh, this is the best choice to go. So again, effectiveness can collect these and understand these, the urgent, not important, that framework, like these kinds of metrics and little frameworks to help make decisions, collecting them, understanding them, owning them, Pareto principle, things like this can really help effectiveness, I think, scale up and be able to have much more capacity.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Good metrics, good heuristics, qualitative and quantitative data, like all of that is really important. So I think that's, I'm glad you made me look at my notes because I think that's a big one.
Yes. Okay. So that's the driver of memory and the co-pilot of effectiveness. High expectations for both. You can increase your capacity. You can expect a lot of yourself as an ISTJ. And if you have too low of expectations in either of these functions, you're probably going to erode a sense of self-trust and probably self-love because you're going to go, if I'm really honest with myself, I could do more. I could do better. I have more capacity. I've got more to give. I've got more to stretch. And by having high expectations, like you're striving for that. You feel good about it. Wow, look at what I did. Look at what I accomplished. Look at how I'm stretching. Look at how I'm growing. I really have a good relationship with myself. I want to send love and receive love now. I feel good about all of that. That's really great.
Yeah, it's the path to self-esteem, self-trust, self-value, self-worth, like all selves, right? Yeah. Overcoming obstacles, pushing ourselves out of our comfort zones, doing more, having those high expectations. It's the path to like being centered and going like, no, I got this.
So that's all the good news. Now here's the challenging news for ISTJs. Let's talk about that 10-year-old and 3-year-old. Let's go to the 10-year-old first. This is sitting right behind the co-pilot in the car model from the owner's manual, ISTJ owner's manual. And this mental process at the 10-year-old certainty level is authenticity. That's its nickname. Technically introverted feeling. This is a very important part for an ISTJ. It's a very, you have a pretty close relationship with this part of yourself. Even though there's a lot of uncertainty here, I would say ISTJs, but it's also very intimate and close to you. You don't necessarily broadcast this to the world, but it's a significant part. It's the part of you that deeply cares about other people. It's the part of you where your heart comes out and you can get your feelings hurt here because it's a very sensitive part of you. It's a part of you that can stand its ground and put its flag in the ground and have a cause or a movement it wants to get behind, whether it's an advocacy of something or just a personal cause or a deep faith in a religion or a belief structure. This part of you really matters. And again, with the certainty of a 10-year-old, what do 10-year-olds do? They're trying to be adults, right? And so they're trying to do adult things and showcase to the adults in their life, look at how good I'm doing this quote unquote adulting stuff. And so there's a lot of focus there and there's a lot of proving energy and a lot of seeking approval energy in this part of yourself as an ISTJ. And again, you may not want to admit that because that feels icky to even admit that part of you, but that's what's usually going on there for you if you're really honest with yourself. It's kind of attempting to get an approval from others.
Yeah.
And it's really the other side of that co-pilot. In fact, there's a relationship between effectiveness and authenticity in your personality. There's a relationship. They're polarity opposites of each other. So when you have one, you have the other. And that's interesting because that relationship is very important to get balanced correctly, because sometimes that 10-year-old can almost just hijack your entire personality and run the show. And this can erode self-love, because if it's running the show, just like if a real 10-year-old's running the show in a family, it's a dysfunctional family. And so in your personality as a person, if the 10-year-old part of you is running the show, you're seeing dysfunction show up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and in the same way, if a child is neglected in a family, you also have dysfunction. So balancing your relationship with dysfunction is really important. And it's the other half of what John Beebe called the axis of relating to others, right? That co-pilot function of extroverted thinking or effectiveness. That was the parental side.
Yeah.
The other side is what he calls the eternal child. And so it's our relationship to other people that does show up in a childlike way, right? As a 10-year-old. And John says it's the business of children to be loved. And so this is the part of an ISTJ that also deeply seeks to be loved, right? Recognized and approved of. Exactly what you were just saying. So what kind of expectation should an ISTJ set for themselves here? Well, it needs to be reasonable, just like a 10-year-old needs to have reasonable expectations placed upon them. If a parent puts too high of expectations on a child, they become very demoralized. They will do everything they can to try to meet those expectations. Yeah. And they'll go away thinking somehow I failed, even if they didn't realize that the expectations were highly unreasonable. So what part of the quote unquote reasonable expectation for this function is to not take failure in it too personally, to not believe that you somehow are wrong or bad if this function is a little bit more difficult to master, right? Is to tap into. So what does it look like when an ISTJ does tap into it, though? Like, what can they expect of this function? Well, the first is that it can give them some emotional intelligence, right? It can help them be in touch with their emotional processes or the emotions that they're experiencing at any given time. They can learn how to process those emotions. They can learn how to go through complete cycles. They can form values here. They can determine who they are and what they stand for and what's important to them. And they can be sympathetic to other people, even if they haven't experienced the same thing that person has. You talked about introverted sensing or memory, that driver function. Sometimes it can be unsympathetic if a person's life is just too different from theirs. But introverted feeling or authenticity can find the universality of experiences. To go, I know what that feels like, even if I don't know what that situation is. I know what it feels like to express that emotion or to be in a situation. I don't have to have lived in every country on the planet to know what loss is, or to understand what it means when, you didn't get the success that you were seeking, or like all these other universal human experiences. This is the part of an ISTJ that helps them understand what people are going through and helps them understand what they're going through. And so that's a reasonable expectation, is that they can develop sympathy and empathy for other people.
It can also motivate and be very motivational for an ISTJ. This can be part of you, the engine that drives you. Like it's the fire underneath you that gets you going and keeps you going for something.
Right. That's basically understanding your emotions and finding their source, right? Motivation is a lot of times sourcing why I'm feeling so strong about something, right? We have a friend who has ITJ preferences that says that all of a sudden he'll care about something and he's not sure when that started, right? Like, when did I start caring? and that showed up for him, right? And his introverted feeling or authenticity all of a sudden got attached. And so recognizing those, observing them, and looking for their source, going like, okay, why am I motivated the way that I am? Like, what's going on for me? I think that's all very reasonable.
Also, identity comes in here too. A sense of rootedness and identity. Mm-hmm. Like, I just think, and this is a dumb example because it's not universal, but like an ISTJ that has a college or something that they came from, maybe they have like a class ring that they wear that expresses both a totem for that memory process, but also it's a little bit signaling, almost like in an expressive way with jewelry. I think, on the finger, this is who I am. This is where I came from. This is what I'm about. Yeah. Right. There's little totems or expressions of identity that come through. Again, that's just one example. This could be done all sorts of ways.
Yeah, this is my alma mater. Absolutely. So all of that is well within the reach of an ISTJ. I think giving allowances for their own personal interests and passions, right? That's a reasonable expectation. She's now 11 years old, but she wasn't 10 that long ago. And our daughter was super into a bunch of stuff. And she was very aware of the things she was passionate about. And so giving yourself permission to follow your passions and giving yourself permission to follow your interests and go, no, I'm just super into this. It doesn't matter if anybody else understands. This is something that's important to me.
Yeah.
And so following those things. Self-compassion, as mentioned before, and patience. Sometimes this function, if we have too high of expectations if an ISTJ has too high of expectations for their introverted feeling or authenticity, they can become perfectionistic. They can lack patience for themselves because they think they should be doing everything faster and better. But if you recognize that this is a certainty level of a 10-year-old, right? So even if you're doing well, you don't know that until you get approval from others, until you get recognition. That means that you'll have some patience for yourself, right? I think I'm doing a good job, but I'm not sure, right? How would I know if I'm uncertain around it? So maybe I should just, as opposed to beating myself up, I should have patience, right? I should just kind of chill out and say it's probably going to be okay. And then when emotions are overwhelming and confusing, don't believe you failed, right? Allow yourself a little bit of time to sort through them, immediately knowing what this means for you, immediately knowing what this means for your identity, immediately understanding how it relates to your values. Emotions are complex. Even for people who have this function as a driver function, it still takes a long time to sort through and process these things. So if you're not immediately processing all your emotions, if your emotions are overwhelming to you or confusing, or you're just not sure what to think about them, well, that's very normal. So allow yourself to have some confusion. Allow yourself to be in a time period of not knowing what it all means. And then I think not criticizing the self, but learning and allowing oneself to not just process experiences, but emotional experiences. Not expecting to know how every situation is going to make you feel in the future either. Not always trying to anticipate how something's going to make you feel. Being willing to be wrong in some of those patterns and some of those predictions, being willing to experience something and then knowing that you can get to the other side if it didn't turn out well, if it was a negative experience. I think sometimes people with ISTJ preferences don't jump on opportunities. They don't allow themselves to do things that would actually be very healthy for them because they fear that if it's not a good experience, they won't be able to get to the other side of it. And you can have an expectation of this function that you can process emotional experiences. You can get to the other side of them. And then you don't have to fear a situation not being, as good as it could be, because you know that you have the capacity to get to the other side and accept anything.
Yeah.
So unreasonable expectations, though, things that are maybe out of your reach, is never needing to acknowledge or process your emotions. That is an unreasonable expectation for this function, for it to just get over things, to just be able to deal with or handle anything. A level of stoicism that no human could attain. That's an idealistic expectation. That's something that a child would think, right? It's a fantasy to believe you can get through life and not have anything impact you emotionally or take you out. So that is unreasonable. And if you put that expectation on your introverted feeling or authenticity, you're going to be demoralized. You're going to think you failed at life. You're going to always be beating yourself up that you're not just getting over things. It's okay. It's all right to kind of be hit hard by things, and it take a while to process. And then I think always getting approval for your values, always having everybody else, agree with you about the things that are important to you. That's an unreasonable expectation. Remember, it's a 10-year-old, so it's seeking validation and approval from other people, but other people won't always agree with you. They won't agree with your values. And so needing that, almost like needing other people to ratify them, needing other people to agree in order to validate them, that's unreasonable. You're allowed to care about whatever you care about. You're allowed to have the values whatever hits you. This function recognizes that it is a deeply subjective experience to determine the things that are important to you through life. your values, your virtues, your identity, all of these things are very much impressed by all the experiences you have as a unique individual.
Yeah.
So it's okay if other people just don't see things the way that you do. And it doesn't mean they're bad and wrong, and it doesn't mean you're bad and wrong. Just let go of the expectation that you're always going to agree. And that includes with people who are important to you. That includes maybe even your partner in life. They're going to disagree with some of the things that you hold are as important. Now, if you're important to them, they will hold space for them. But that doesn't mean that they're going to agree with them. So that is unreasonable to expect.
I think there's also an element here for an ISTJ where they stand strong in a conviction. They feel very strongly about something. And I think that is very important. And this is the part of an ISTJ that would stand strong. They put the flag in the ground and say, no, this is wrong, or I'm standing for this, or whatever the stance might be. Again, it's going to be unique to the ISTJ. But there is a point at which that 10-year-old idealism of standing strong, the math doesn't bear out anymore. Like the effectiveness, that co-pilot would look at the numbers on paper and go, this doesn't make sense anymore. This doesn't work. This isn't sustainable. This stance that I have is absurd. Like it goes too far. And while it might feel good to have that strong stance, I think that's an improper expectation for this part of yourself. When the math doesn't bear out, look at the numbers. Look at the results. Look at the real hard facts, not your feelings about a situation. And so to expect your feelings to drive everything or trust your feelings above all else, I think you're in uncertain territory as an ISTJ. Now, again, discretion's needed here. That threshold is going to be personal to you. But I would recommend that most ISTJs could look at the numbers. They use their effectiveness to go, what do I actually know is true in a numbered way, in an output way, in a tangible way?
In an impact way.
In an impact way, yes. Not just how I feel strongly about it, but what's the real result of this?
Right.
And I think that's, again, we're going to go back to that polarity of the co-pilot of effectiveness with the 10-year-old of authenticity. It's almost like a coin. If one side is down, you're not seeing it. You're only seeing the top. And if you flip it, you're seeing the other side. And so what do you do with this? Like if you're in effectiveness, like your co-pilot, you're exercising that, you're in that space. In a way, you're almost shutting off the authenticity part of you, and vice versa. If you're on authenticity, you're shutting off the effectiveness. Well, don't let that 10-year-old shut that off. Really what you want to, the metaphor, the example here would be, you want to see that coin on its side and spinning so fast, oscillating, it's balanced. You can see, it's hard to tell which side you're seeing because you're going back and forth in a balanced way. But at the end of the day, I think the co-pilot of effectiveness needs to pull rank, and the numbers need to make sense.
Yeah.
Like the numbers metaphorically, not literal, like they could be literal numbers, but you know what I mean? Like the math needs to make sense in a tangible expression or way.
The outcome.
Yes.
Right? And how it's actually impacting people in the scenario. And I think the way that I would frame that in terms of the language we're using of expectations is, don't expect that you were always right the first time.
Yeah.
Right. Like sometimes we make poor calls. Sometimes we just didn't have enough of a frame of reference. Sometimes the things that are really important to us when we're younger are no longer important to us when we're older. So to hold on to them means that we didn't actually grow or learn anything. We didn't actually, we can't change our minds. And so the expectation of having always seen it from, the right angle the first time, always having been with it, almost like a sense of purity. Like I never make the wrong call. I never see things, like if things are binary, good or bad, I always saw it good the first time. It's like, well, actually things are a little bit more complicated than that. And it's okay to reevaluate. It's okay to let go of some things and adopt new things. That's all right.
Yeah.
And so
that's a great real world example. Let's say you're an ISTJ looking at somebody's behavior, and you're just certain you know the motivation behind that behavior. You just feel it strongly in that 10-year-old process. You're like, no, I would know my motivation in that situation. That's that other person's motivation. I just know it to be true. And yet that's not the result you could see in the real world. Like you see the impact of that person's behavior. It's actually not maybe as bad as you would project it to be.
Or you asked them and they said no, and they were being sincere.
There you go. They gave you the real reason why they did it. Or you could find that out and it's like, oh, well, maybe I need to question my assumption on why people do what they do. Because I'm seeing the real impact. I should probably take what I see as the result over what I feel strongly about. Like that's a real world example that happens all the time for ISTJs. And so that's what we're talking about when we say look at the math, look at the actual, not what you feel strongly. Although what you feel strongly can be a guide, it just needs to be in its proper positions, proper expectation, like you've been talking about.
Right. I knew somebody with ITJ preferences that was an advocate, like an activist for a cause. That when they got sort of in with this group, it felt like every time they were making gains, the group undermined their ability to actually make true gains. And over time, they went, well, what are we doing here? And then they realized, oh, this is more, for a lot of other people, this is more about the activism than actually
seeing the result.
Seeing the results. And then they started reevaluating everything in there. And they ended up making a 180-degree turn on what they believed about this cause. They were like, oh, actually, if I'm looking at the results of everything, I'm actually on the other side of the cause. This other thing is actually more, not on the other side. They're not anti what they thought before. They're just, they got more refined.
Yeah.
And so over time, if somebody with ISTJ preferences is willing to learn, to see the results, learn from past mistakes, not feel like they had to have everything right the first time, what they're doing is they're sort of refining everything throughout their life. They're just kind of dialing it in a little bit more. And so, allow your 10-year-old function, this introverted feeling or authenticity, to be refined over time. Allow it to not have to have been right the first time. Yeah. And people, ISTJs that do that, they're usually a lot happier people. They're patient and they're more chill and they're more sympathetic and compassionate, and including with the self.
It's okay to feel deeply. It's normal as an ISTJ to feel deeply. And just because other people may not know that about you, it's normal to have these deep feelings. And just understand their proper place. Anything else on this before we jump to the 3-year-old?
So just to mention this polarity, right, of extroverted thinking effectiveness and introverted feeling authenticity. When the coin is spinning, like you mentioned, this is what Carl Jung called a transcendent function. It almost turns into its own thing.
Yeah.
And this is really about balancing objectivity with compassion. It's about making ethical choices that have real world impact in a positive way, or in a way that at least aligns with your values. It's about throwing passion and feeling deeply into your projects. And it's about making sure that you're not just numbers oriented and results oriented, but you're also people and human oriented. And people with ISTJ preferences that figure that out are able to create a transcendent relationship with these two functions. In the quote unquote axis of relating to self, or axis of relating to others, rather, they are contributors. They're contributors in this beautiful way. Sometimes they're very active in their communities, and they, in very practical ways, beautify and contribute to their to their towns or their communities in their cities. It's not uncommon for them to take on activist causes or to just be a volunteer, right? And so when these two functions are really contributing, it removes an obstruction to self-love, because everybody wants to be a contributor. Everybody wants to see that they are not just taking, but also giving. And so part of the self-love component, or the obstruction to self-love, which is, am I contributing? It's solved by really getting these two functions in balance for an ISTJ.
Yeah. Let's talk about that 3-year-old.
Okay.
So this is the final piece of your CAR model coming from the ISTJ Owner's Manual. This is about when I say sophistication, again, certainty level of a 3-year-old.
Right.
Like we used to say sophisticated, and I think people got the idea that meant capacity or the ability there. You might be in a career as an ISTJ that you've had to pull upon this. So your 3-year-old is nicknamed exploration. And again, extroverted intuition is the technical name. It's a very disruptive mental process. It's designed to say, I don't care what the precedent is. What's the new? What's the new shiny combination? If I take, peanut butter and I mix it with chocolate, what would happen? Reese's, like that kind of a thinking, right? That's like the dumbest, lowest level version of it. All the way up to, going to space, or what if we didn't have to start from here, or any kind of what if question, like what's possible in the scenario. If we didn't have to start from what we already know and what we're already in line with, what could we see come of all of this? Mm-hmm. It's needed because it helps us when we do get stagnant, when we do get caught in a rut as society, as people, we do need some disruption. We do need some invention and some new ways of doing things, some technology, some, new perspectives. And I think this brings us that as a society, but also as a person. And this is an important part of you. Just because it's 3-year-old is not important. It's just we have to have proper expectation here as an ISTJ for you.
Right. So the 10-year-old function, because it's our relationship to others, its uncertainty can be sort of sated by other people's approval. So that's why we caution, like, don't think that you have to get everybody's approval on this function in order to feel better about it. You're allowed to have your own feelings about it. But really, that's part of how we calm down. When we feel uncertain in our 10-year-old, we calm down by getting outer world approval. But this 3-year-old function is the other side of what John called the axis of relating to self, meaning that we can't get other people's approval for this, or at least if they give us our approval, we don't care as much. So it's an uncertain part that can't find it can't find comfort, right? And so it's just deeply uncertain. It just is, and that means that part of making peace with it and setting expectations for it is to go, as a person who is built to seek comfort as a symbol of safety and security, there's a part of you that is never going to be comfortable.
Mm.
It's never going to feel certain. You're just going to have to make uncertainty part of the norm. And so what kinds of expectations can an ISTJ set, right? Well, the first one is you can do some disruption in your life. You can have adaptability to your schedules. You can have adaptability to, like there's a little spontaneity that you can add to your life. You can have some sense of freeness. You don't have to always be responsible at every given moment. You can have like what did Disney used to say in their commercials? You can show your Disney side, right?
Yeah.
You can have like a little bit of childlike play and wonder. This is a part of you that is deeply curious. And so fostering an openness and a curiosity to new ideas, adopting new technologies, right? Not just doing what you've been doing, even if it's inefficient, but being open to new technologies that make your life easier and make other people's lives easier. So all of that is reasonable, right? An openness, curiosity, and adaptability, all of that is very reasonable. What's unreasonable is to expect yourself to always at the last minute have a creative solution, or to believe that you failed if you can't pull a rabbit out of a hat. ISTJs sometimes can do that. They can sometimes pull a rabbit out of a hat, but it is not as consistent. And part of the reason why is because they're uncertain of whether or not this last minute 11th hour solution is actually going to work.
Yeah.
Although sometimes your mind can come through with you for you in those ways. So not relying on it, but being open when it does happen. When you do have a creative new idea, not immediately rejecting it, but going, no, maybe this could work, right? It's like sort of allowing yourself to have that part brainstorm and come up with new solutions and become a creative problem solver.
Yeah, I would also say that this part of you as an ISTJ would love to be able to guess what's going to happen into the future and be able to speculate and pattern recognize probably the probable outcome of the scenario or the situation or this trajectory. I wouldn't trust it though. I think the expectation of trusting it at a high level, going, oh, I know what's going to happen with that person because they're acting this way. Much like, reading other people's motivations can be a challenge for that 10-year-old of authenticity. Reading the pattern of what's going to happen, the predictable outcome of something, that might be fun to play with. But if you treat it seriously, I think, and you start to guess the result, I think that's where you're going to run into some trouble.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
It should be like a spice, right? It's like a flavoring. It can't be the main dish. And so
certainly not making decisions or moving through your life that way.
That's right. Exactly. And so if you're in a time period where maybe there's a lot of upheaval in your life, maybe there's a lot of, maybe you change jobs, maybe you change locations, maybe you change like maybe there's a bunch of stuff that has altered in your life. Expecting yourself to immediately find your comfort zone, to immediately adapt, that might be too heavy of a lift, right? It might take some time to find your routines. It might take some time to kind of feel comfortable in this brand new environment with all of these new things. The idea that, like what you just mentioned, which is, what did you just mention?
Well, it's the idea. I mean, I think if we look back at like the lockdowns and the pandemic,
right,
when our normal routines were broken apart, and we didn't have a substrate as society. I think this really plays into society even more. I saw a lot of people, not just ISTJs, go, oh, I know what's going on, the conspiracy theory here, or this is what's motivating these people over here. And you abstract things and you build them up even bigger in your head than maybe what they really are. And then some people operate from that quote unquote understanding, but it's not really based in any reality. It's all just abstraction and imagination. And something like a big event like a pandemic creates maybe the environment for this to sow seeds of doubt and speculation and confusion. And then you're like, I don't have my normal routines to fall on. So I guess all I have is this imagination, this pattern. What will happen? And then it creates anxiety and to solve that, you like try to over imagine, and it just creates this whole thing.
Right.
And again, I'm not saying every ISTJ experienced this, but I just think that's a tangible example. I saw that happen with a few people.
Right.
They felt very unmoored. They felt very disconnected from a normal life and routine. And again, not just ISTJs, I felt that way during that time period.
Right.
So I think that's what I'm talking about.
Right. Thank you. So you just connected the two thoughts for me. Trying, like, it's almost like trying to find a ballast in predicting the unknown as opposed to reestablishing your own continuity, right? Your own routine. Thank you. That was the thought. I was like, what? There was like something that was almost connecting for me, but it didn't quite get there. And then it just did. Yes, exactly. The expectation that you will find stability and security in prediction and knowing what's happening in the darkness, right? Trying to, being suspicious. Or conspiratorial, and that will help you feel moored. It's like, well,
or even being idealistic about how you want a scene to play out. Like you might have an expectation, like, oh, I imagine when I propose to my partner, it's going to look this way. It's going to be this big, and then you were wrong on your guess. Now you're disappointed because you didn't get it. You didn't know, like, you know what I mean? You were like tapped into the imagination of it more than what the real of it would really be on the ground.
Right, exactly. That's actually
stuff.
Probably a better way of saying it too, because there's going to be a bunch of people who are like, trying to guess our politics by, because if we say something's conspiratorial, I'm actually a famous conspiracy theorist. So, but I won't say which ones. I won't say which conspiracies.
I have friends that blame all ENTPs this. They're like, all ENTPs are conspiracy theorists. I'm like, really?
I am too. I can't help it. So it's not like I'm anti-conspiracy theory, and you can't guess my politics, I promise. But yes, exactly. It's like it's an over idealism. And so, having an expectation of how things are going to roll out, and then being disappointed. Exactly. One thing too, I think, is too heavy of a lift for your 3-year-old of extroverted thinking or extroverted intuition or exploration too, is that this is a function that doesn't just come up with inventive ideas; it also sells them.
Yeah.
There's a word that our friend Dr. Dario Nardi applies to a flavoring of this function that he calls the marketer, and so. What I've seen a couple different times is ISTJs will come up with a new idea, a creative solution, something that probably is pretty solid. And when they present it, it doesn't get adopted, right? It doesn't, people aren't persuaded. They'll bring it to a meeting and nobody listens to their idea. Well, this can be really demoralizing if you put a lot of time and thought into it and you're pretty sure this is an idea that will work. And then everybody just shrugs it off. To believe that people will immediately be sold an idea the first time you present it, that's too high of an expectation.
Yeah. Because
the function itself, we both lead with it. This is our driver function. And we both know how often people disregard our ideas, and we come up with them all the time. So if an idea is good, part of making sure that we don't implement disruptive ideas all the time willy-nilly is we have a check and balance system in society, which says, persuade me, right? Persuade me on this good idea. If it's a really good one, it might take a little time and effort to persuade. And so that's part of it, is recognizing that if you really do have a good idea, it's okay if it takes a little while for other people to warm up to it, in the same way that it might have taken you a while to warm up. And it doesn't mean, like, I remember an ISTJ woman thinking that it was sexism. She's like, nobody's listening to me because I'm a woman. And I'm like, but I'm right here and people are listening to some of my ideas. So I don't think it's just about being a woman. I think it's actually that you are shy when you present them, right? You're kind of like, there's an uncertainty there that makes it so that you're not selling your idea. So my recommendation to her was like, we'll try to sell it a little bit more, right? Like try to put a little bit of pizzazz in it, try to fluff it up and make it exciting. And she's like, oh yeah, okay, I could see that. So, so having an expectation that even when you come up with a good idea, it might take a little bit of persuasion. And that's like, I think something an ISTJ can learn. They can learn the art of persuasion. Now, a lot of times it looks a little bit more extroverted thinking or effectiveness, which is candor, directness, like sort of going like putting it in a presentation, selling its benefits, as opposed to just getting people excited by it. But it doesn't matter. Did it work, right? Did the person adopt the idea? And so leaning on that extroverted thinking or effectiveness to help sell and persuade, I think makes it so that now you're bringing it up into the realm of high expectations, as opposed to believing that people should just come up, like just adopt the idea because it's a good one.
Yeah.
So, so those are some of the, I think it's important for an ISTJ to have reasonable expectations of this function, to not always think that they're going to be the life of the party, that they're not always going to be able to sell a good idea, that they're not always going to be able to come up with 11th hour solutions, but that they can be creative problem solvers. They can be people who, if they take enough time and effort and observe things over and over and over again through their introverted sensing or memory, they can be pattern recognizers. They can start to see trends. They can see things that are, coming down the pike, or, new ways of doing things. All of that's very reasonable. I think it's more about speed, right? Just recognize that it might be a little bit of a slower process for you, even though the function itself tends to want to be fast.
Before we move on to the part where we're going to talk about what all the rest of us can learn from ISTJs, I want to draw attention to that driver of memory along with this exploration 3-year-old. That's the axis of relating to self. Like you said, no one can make you feel certain in that 3-year-old process. It's kind of a self-certainty you have to bring there. You have to bring this for yourself. You have to understand yourself there. But I think those expectations, I think you can also increase the expectation of that 3-year-old for yourself as an ISTJ using the driver as the access point. As an example, my uncle, I know. Also, I was thinking my aunt, my mom's sister, is also ISTJ perfect. I forgot to mention her at the beginning of the show. But so I have a few ISTJs in my family, my aunt and uncle. I think I've seen both of them now in elderhood look back on their life and pattern and connect things that have happened both in their personal past, but also in society past. Like my aunt and I had a great conversation recently about, she's like, why does your uncle, my husband, do these things? And I'm like, oh, this, and she's like, oh, and she starts reviewing like his type preferences and some of the things that are going on for him and herself. And she's making the connections from their past. But she had to have lived all that life to look back on it, to start to make those connections and find the pattern in it. So I think that for an ISTJ, for you and me, Antonia, we have this as a strength, this exploration. But for an ISTJ, it's okay to look and you almost slow the process down. We use it in real time. Right now, I'm throwing patterns and I'm connecting things, and it's available to an ISTJ. But I think there's a true power, and the expectation can be high. When you're doing a review, whether it's a short review of a most recent past or a long past, I think there's a ton of available connections to be made in those reviews. And that might be where you see it show up more, not in real time, like in the meeting, and you got to come up with an idea right off the top of your head. Although you can do that. That's very available to ISTJs. But looking back and sitting with the material and going, oh, I have an idea because I'm looking at this connected to this. I've seen that play out. I bet this is a good idea. Boom, connection, great idea, bring that forward.
Yeah.
I think that's a proper expectation there.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's very available. I think a lot of ISTJs feel very put on the spot when they're in a brainstorming session or a meeting. They have to come up with an idea.
Yeah, maybe not very available, but I mean, I don't want to diminish an ISTJ that has that experience. Like, no, I can come up with ideas on the fly.
Yeah,
I just don't want to marginalize them because I know that happens.
I don't think many ISTJs see themselves that way, though.
Sure.
I don't think it would feel kind of like with, me as ENTP preferences. It's like, no, I can rigorously stay to a schedule. I'm like, no, I'm not sure if I could.
Let me be more clear.
Right.
They have the idea on the fly. They may not articulate or say the idea on the fly.
Right.
Like, I think ideas come to everybody. I mean, our cats probably have ideas all the time. People get ideas a lot and connections. Right. It's just how confident are you to bring it forward?
Yes.
Like in a business meeting or a family get together or something.
Yeah.
That's probably what I mean to intend.
I do think, though, that an ISTJ will resonate a lot more with what you're talking about, which is if I have time to review.
Yeah.
And and we're talking about two people, your aunt and uncle on each side of your family. They are in their elderhood. They're in their 70s. And so they have the benefit of having a lot of material to review and to ruminate over. But I think a younger ISTJs can also tap into this by doing proper processing of their own experiences through mastery, right? And through borrowed learning. And I think when an introverted sensing or memory user does a lot of thoughtful rumination, these patterns, these intuitions, these, abilities to kind of, and I don't mean in a conspiratorial way. I mean, like legitimately to see behind the curtain, to legitimately figure out what's going on and to observe these patterns and trends, that becomes way more available to them if they're willing to do proper processing and review.
It doesn't have to be their own life. My uncle's been reading a book. We've actually talked about, we did a 2-part series on this book, the
American Nations.
American Nations, thank you. Which talks about like the 13 or 15 subcultures of the United States. He's been reading this material and he's having conversations with me about it. He's making connections. Look at Yankee, the Yankeedom of New England and the Deep South, and like he's making these connections. Like, this makes a lot of sense. I can see a difference in people and the different parts of the country, and he's making connections. He didn't necessarily like live the last 200 years himself. He read about it in a compressed volume, a book. And he's drawing patterns from the material, the deeply researched and written material.
Well, he's very open to them too.
Yes.
And there's a high degree of openness because it matches his experience.
Yeah.
And so I think, being willing to follow curiosity and be open and review one's own experiences and borrow experiences from others, I think that absolutely can create that spinning coin relationship, that transcendent relationship with those two functions. That does give an ISTJ a higher amount of certainty. Like you said, as an access point through a very certain part, which is the driver, they can increase their sense of certainty in their pattern recognition. And then, have this openness, this curiosity, the ability to see a bigger picture, and do so through legitimate means, not through like kind of like fearful conspiratorial means or worry or, feeling very disappointed when things don't pan out. But through no, I've seen this before, right? This will come again. I know that.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about what the rest of us, the other 15 personality types, can learn from an ISTJ that has discovered or has a good relationship with themselves and shows themselves love. So just to review real briefly, we looked at the ISTJ owner's manual that we have here at Personality Hacker. We pulled out the car model from the owner's manual, which basically lays out the cognition of your mind as an ISTJ into a 4-passenger car. You have a driver, a co-pilot, a 10-year-old, a 3-year-old, driver of memory, the co-pilot of effectiveness, the 10-year-old of authenticity, and the 3-year-old of exploration. And you want to have high expectation for the 2 front seat functions, the driver and the co-pilot. You want to have moderate expectations, proper expectations, reasonable expectations for the 10-year-old and the 3-year-old, right? And if you have this all in balance, our experience has been in working with clients and coaching, we've seen it happen. People have an opening and a good relationship with themselves, and they have a greater capacity for self-love because of that. So that's what we're talking about, just to review, to bring us back to center. So what, Antonia, can the rest of us, I don't have ISTJ preferences, you don't have ISTJ preferences, there's somebody listening right now that's not an ISTJ, what can all of us learn from ISTJs about self-love?
So I think after a lifetime of reviewing their own experiences and patterning, right? Not just reviewing, but also patterning what those experiences mean, pulling the right lessons from it, showing patience to oneself, really pondering deep ethical, issues, like really maybe deep moral reasoning, observing the impact of things, recognizing that we're not always right the first time and that we have to contend with that we can't be perfectionists because nobody's perfect. Understanding how we show up isn't just about us. It's about how we are, the imprint we're leaving on the world around us, the people and the environment around us. After all of that, and I think even younger ISTJs can tap into this, but you definitely see this in more seasoned ISTJs, is almost like a they become pragmatic philosophers, right? They become advocates for compassion. They become advocates for carefulness, but carefulness with openness, really understanding the implications of the things that we're doing. I think that there's a deep philosophical streak, and they can become true advocates, right? Like in their communities, in their families, in a larger way, right? They can become invested in politics or business, or just anything where they can really lend this mentorship, this philosophical mentorship to other people, to not just be tuned into the day to day, right? Not just the practical duties of life, but a bigger frame, and as we mentioned before, being models of something, right? Being models of how we make good decisions, how we do things in a way that shows that we are taking responsibility for our actions, that we're independent, that we're going to own the things that we have done, and that we need to do that not just as individuals, but as a society. I think that this is really a beautiful manifestation of a seasoned ISTJ that shows themselves self-love that everybody can, I think anybody could do well to model.
We've talked about ISTJs being stewards in our world. This idea of stewardship, where you didn't start the thing, you were handed the stewardship of it, and you have it for a period of time, and then you eventually hand that off to the next person or entity that's going to steward that. I think that makes sense to ISTJs, this idea of continuity over a long period of time. Like people in government, for example, are stewards of our governments. They didn't start the government necessarily, but they're stewarding it while they're running it and operating it, and then they hand it off to the next generation. So I think this idea of stewardship comes in here, and I think this idea of pragmatic, what the exact word you used?
A pragmatic philosopher.
Pragmatic philosopher. The idea of pragmatic, it's a stewardship not just of the functionality of the roles. Right? I think that's what you're tuning into, because I think we automatically go, stewardship, like the operation of it. That paperwork gets filed in a certain way. The procedures stay consistent. We do things in a consistent manner. It's not just the operation. It's also the way we think and approach things. That's where the philosopher part comes in, the practical philosopher. It stays consistent with the things we're doing, but it has also a stewardship of its reasons, its perspectives, its understanding, its resonance with things.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that layers on just the stewardship of functionality.
Yeah.
It's very important. I feel like they can be vanguards for that too.
For sure.
Especially that part of them that's that introverted feeling or authenticity that stands for something. It can stand for this philosophical continuity as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wrote down in my notes, after a lifetime of patterning and deep moral reasoning, the ISTJ might become surprisingly reflective about ethical issues, societal structures, and the human condition, way beyond daily practicality and duty, as well as becoming an advocate for reasoned compassion.
Yeah.
And I think that's been my observation. I used to have, you'll hear it in our early podcasts, where I kind of talk about how ISTJs don't like me. And
I remember that.
I used to talk about it all the time, like ISTJs don't like me.
They like you better now?
Well,
Are
first
you more
of all, I opened my frame to who is an ISTJ, and I realized that there were way more ISTJs in my life than I had previously recognized. Because I'm not sure why, but I wasn't the kind of person who was, I turned this into a profession, but I didn't run around and type everybody. I just don't do that. Like I give people a little bit of space. I think it's because my entire family thinks that what I do is like suspicious. So I got kind of careful about, like who I project type onto.
Well, just because you're a car mechanic doesn't mean like, can I fix your car? Can I fix your car?
Right.
Can I fix your car? It's like you're not just asking your family members, can I please fix your car?
What kind of car do you have? Can I look at it? Right. So I kind of didn't do that. And then when I got a little bit bigger frame, I realized how many ISTJs I actually had in my life and how great of a relationship I had with them. There is a certain sort of like myopic, anybody who has introverted sensing or memory in a very like sort of one-sided way is probably not going to like anybody with extroverted intuition preferences, because it's going to be threatening. It's going to force them to contend with that part of who they are. And so there was a little bit of that going on. But now that I'm observing sort of like all of the different and just in general with type, all of the different flavors of ISTJs, all the different flavors of all the types, but all the flavors of ISTJs, I realize that they're some of my favorite type. I really love a well-seasoned ISTJ. And they're giving like the generosity of spirit and the thoughtfulness and the deep appreciation. almost always, if I talk to somebody who's a seasoned ISTJ, they're very grateful for my exploration ideas and the models that I bring. They're almost always like, wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I just love this type. And so I love that. I love that ability they have to stay steady, but still, kind of be big teddy bears, right? Like all of them have a nougaty center and it's delightful. and so I have learned, I would say this is the type that I had to grow into an appreciation for. And now that I'm there, I just adore them. I just adore them. And I love that pragmatic philosopher side.
Many ISTJs had to grow into their appreciation for you too, Antonia, I'm sure.
For ENTPs, listen, I get it. If somebody's
sure.
like, ENTPs are my least favorite type, I'm like, I'm right there with you. not entirely, but man, when we're younger, your son Gunnar, who has ENTP preferences, yesterday we were talking about it, and he said, not that I need to spend any more time on this podcast, I know it's already gone late, but he said, ENTPs start out as the worst. They start out as the worst, probably the worst type. And he's like, but if we just hang in there, we can become awesome. We can become amazing. I'm like, that tracks. We do start out really challenging. And so I can appreciate why I turned people up.
Yeah. I don't think I was mostly teasing, but fair enough. I don't know if you turned people off, but
used to.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to hear from you, and Tony wants to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode. We'd love to hear from you. You've been listening to us talk. You probably have some things you'd like to express. There's not a third microphone that you can come to and talk in real time, but you can do this asynchronously. Come over to the website underneath this podcast, leave a comment, ask a question. More importantly, share your story. I really encourage stories. They're compressed experiences so we can see what's actually going on for you with real world examples, and your story, your narrative can explain that to us, and we can get a conversation started. People can understand from each other what's going on, because not all ISTJs are going to be the same. You're going to have your unique experience to bring to the table. And maybe you're a different type. Maybe you've got an ISTJ in your life, or maybe you just learned a lot about ISTJs. You got a question around today. Again, come over, make your voice heard. Personalityhacker.com.
Yeah. And if you enjoyed the podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. You can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. We're starting to get reviews more often again, which is great.
It's juicing you up. It's motivating you.
It's motivating me. I'm like, oh, I'm getting another review. Awesome. So
not just a star rating, like people write stuff like,
that's right.
Hey, this is the perspective I have of the show and all that.
The review is the important thing. So, so if you want to give us a gift, if you have benefited from the podcast, maybe even for many years, and you want to leave a review for us, I would be super duper grateful, because it's like it's a shot in the arm, right?
There you go.
A little adrenaline in the heart. So please do so. You might be watching us on YouTube, because we have a video podcast now. And if you are, you can subscribe, and hit the bell to let you know when future episodes come out. And maybe we haven't done your type yet in the self-love series. So definitely hit that bell so that you know when your type has come up. And as Joel mentioned, we had recently somebody with ISTJ preferences come through our Personality Life Path program, and they're an amazing person. And I think you, as somebody with ISTJ preferences, should consider doing the same. She said it was a game changer for her. So the Personality Life Path program is an 8-week digital mentorship or virtual mentorship that culminates in a live event experience. And I have heard from many people that it literally has changed their lives. It's basically an audit of your relationship to all of your functions.
Yeah.
And all 8 of the cognitive functions. And then it culminates in trying to figure out what is the highest leverage thing that you can be doing from this point in your life forward. If you are interested, come over to personalityhacker.com. And at the very top, at least at the time period of this podcast, there is a button that will take you to more information about LifePath. And I'm saying this right now because it is my favorite thing that we do now. I love the Personality Life Path. It is game-changing, not just for the people who join, but it's game-changing for me every single time.
Yeah.
So I strongly recommend that you go check out that program, especially if you're feeling stuck in your life, if you're feeling like it's time for a change, if you're feeling like you're not really sure what's coming up next, if you're struggling with purpose, if you're struggling with where, what you're supposed to be doing. Basically, if you have confusion, if you have any confusion about your life, your relationships, your business, Personality Life Path is the thing to do.
One of the challenges we have is we know it works so well and changes people's lives, but it's a big jump. So you might want to just, if you're brand new, you might need to start at the owner's manual for ISTJs, the basics, that car model we talked about. It goes through that, talks about how your mind will hijack you and how to get out of that, how to get into flow. how to set yourself up for success. That also might be an avenue as well to explore. But we just got back from Life Path. That's
We did. We just got back like a week ago. So I'm like, go do Life Path. It's amazing.
We're riding a high because it's such a life-changing experience for people that it's top of mind. Yep. And it is the thing that I believe most people should be doing. You may not be ready yet, though. And that's where the owner's manual could come in for ISTJs. So start at either place, the full, the whole enchilada, the big package, or just starting small with your ISTJ owner's manual to get the basic building blocks of how you're wired. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.